event in a series that began last autumn at the Camberwell School of Arts, where a group of artists, architects, designers, and academics came together to discuss projects in that transient state between an idea and being realized. Titled Between Thought and Space, it looked at how we design and create work in response to a place, questioning how do we manifest our ideas in reality. So the event was organized by Miraj Ahmed and Kelly Corpening as a prelude to the exhibition they were organizing in Dilston Grove, which is a former church and one of the earliest examples of poured concrete construction. And it sits within Southwark Park. The exhibition invited different designers and artists to respond to this unusual hybrid of industrial and ecclesiastical space, with a series of large-scale installations, performances, and artworks. The exhibition opened last week, and the second event on the subject, that was the second event on the subject, and it revealed the installations on site. If the first event talked about ideas and where they were in their stages of development, and the second event was about the realization of those ideas, this conversation begins to reflect on the process of manifesting, making, and installing, what it means to respond to a place or a site, and how that spans across the different disciplines of art, architecture, sound art, and choreography. In conversation tonight is architectural historian Professor Jane Rendell, and art critic and writer Ossian Ward, with Between Thought and Space project leaders Miraj and Kelly, who will introduce and moderate the discussion. So to tell you a bit more about the speakers, Jane Rendell is a writer and architectural historian. Her books include Site Writing, Art and Architecture, and The Pursuit of Pleasure. She's currently working on a new book on transitional spaces in architecture and psychoanalysis. She's co-editor of Pattern, Critical Architecture, and Spatial Imagination, and is professor of architecture and art and vice dean of research at the Bartlett UCL. Ossian Ward is head of content at Listen Gallery and a writer on contemporary art. Until 2013, he was the chief art critic and visual arts editor at Time Out London, and has contributed to magazines such as Esquire, The New Statesman, and Wallpaper, as well as newspapers including The Evening Standard, The Guardian, The Observer, The Times, and Independent on Sunday. Formerly editor of Art Review and the V&A magazine, he has also worked at the Art newspaper and edited a biennial publication, The Artist's Yearbook for Thames and Hudson, from 2005 to 2010. His new book, titled Ways of Looking, How to Experience Contemporary Art, is published by Lawrence King. So Kelly Corpening is an artist who exhibits internationally, and many of her projects are co-developed as books. Her conference presentations include Just What Is It that makes today's art schools so different and so appealing at the ICA in London, What Makes a Good Drawing at the National Gallery, Drawing Out at RMIT in Melbourne, and A History Uncovered, A Future Imagined at the Paris College of Art in France. She's been course leader for the BA Drawing at Camberwell College of Arts since 2006. And finally, Miraj Ahmed is a painter and architect who's taught at the AA since 2000. He's currently a unit master of Diploma 1, and he's also an associate lecturer at Camberwell College of Arts, and was a design fellow at Cambridge University from 2006 to 2014. I'll now hand over to them for the conversation, but before I do, I wanted to remind everyone to please join us after the lecture for a drinks reception in the South Jury Room. That's the room near the entrance. And also that we have a gallery talk organized by our membership department tomorrow at 12 p.m. at Dilston Grove, where Miraj and some of the other artists involved will take guests on a tour of the space, explaining the ideas that led to these installations. All the details of how to attend the tour are on our website under the What's On section, so I hope you'll join us there. And so now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jane, Ossian, Miraj, and Kelly.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. And just a bit of, Kelly and I are going to sort of start off with a bit of background of this project, which is, I have to say, all credit to Kelly, because it was an idea that Kelly had a number of years ago, and we had a conversation, and this conversation is still going on now. So it's really been a kind of a wonderful experience for me to be sort of part of it. And just going back to that early conversation, it was really the fact that we were collaborating. I teach with Kelly at Camberwell a very particular kind of collaboration course, which is this idea that we can bring architectural methodology to art school as a kind of way of looking and transcribing and making work. And that we've been kind of doing. We do it for 5 weeks every year, and it's kind of really interesting. And sometimes we get our two institutions or three institutions together, which is very interesting for students, but also us. So the background is really that we have this idea that we kind of work into our kind of working professional lives as lecturers, but also in our sort of personal practice. So the idea of our kind of project, the site specifics. I mean, we kind of we had the idea, and then we looked around for a space, and we found Dilston Grove, or Dilston Grove found us, and it seemed to kind of fit the bill because it has an amazing kind of location, but also an amazing history. So this is its location, Southwark Park, which was kind of refurbished back in 2001, sort of lottery funded. And so the Dilston Grove building is actually part of the history of its area. It's really of the place, and it's really of the park, which was something that was very important to us. So its history is really the history of kind of London, I would say. It's sandwiched between the River Thames, but also the kind of the major kind of infrastructural work of London Bridge to Greenwich, the railway, but also the docks. So it's kind of its sort of material presence is somehow linked to that kind of energy that was happening in sort of from about the 1700s to 1900s. So this kind of gives you an idea of its location. So this is Dilston Grove just here, just below that oval, which is the old cricket ground. Surrey Docks, River Thames, the major railway line that links to Kent. And so this kind of massive engineering works of sort of the docks, and then we get to the history of Southwark Park, which is very much part of the sort of the Victorian drive towards cleaner air. This was a time when there was a lot of cholera around, typhoid, and one of the kind of the solutions that was kind of proposed was that to improve the air quality of London. So this is kind of the backdrop. So there's a lot of at that time there's a lot of sort of missionary work as well, sort of concurrent with that. And Clare College in Cambridge commissioned this mission church. And this is a picture of the two gentlemen who designed the building after this one. Actually, this one fell down. It was demolished as a result of subsidence. And John Simpson and Maxwell Ayrton came along and brought this new material, concrete, and built one of the first, actually, nobody really knows which is the first concrete building in England, but this is maybe one of them. And it's designed as a sort of a Tuscan church. It's actually built on sort of golden proportions, and very unusual. So what's also unusual is that the way that these architects kind of developed, and then it became the sort of the early modernist movement actually within England. So Ayrton worked closely with Owen Williams, but also designed the Wembley Stadium as part of the British Empire exhibition in 1924. So the tumultuous past sort of extends into the war. It was heavily bombed, but somehow the building escaped that.
And that was the plan.
Yeah.
That in this area they could build an indestructible church.
And it's still here.
Yeah.
When much of Southwark was actually heavily bombed. And of course, the kind of the social history of Southwark Park as a kind of a place for gathering. It was also used as a gun emplacement site. And then post-war, this is Maydew House, which is right beside Dilston Grove. And what's interesting is that the way I see it is that it's sort of the progeny of Dilston Grove. It somehow emerged out of the kind of the interest in concrete and the experimental exploration of concrete. So, and round about this time, this is when the building became sort of derelict, and Richard Wentworth moved in. So he's got stories of how this was just completed as they moved in to use Dilston Grove as a studio. And in 1984, the Bermondsey Artists Group created Cafe Gallery, which was kind of, again, part of this kind of sort of emergence out of decline. So the park was actually quite derelict, and as was Dilston Grove. And after Richard Wentworth and his friends vacated, it was then taken over by the Bermondsey Artists Group, who then created Cafe Gallery and took over Dilston Grove from Southwark Council. And this brings us to now. The building was refurbished in 2010. It's one of the most amazing kind of art project spaces in London, with its kind of strange proportions, its amazing use of concrete. Yeah, so I'll just run through a few of these photographs of the building as it is now. This is a model of the building. And of course, the patina of the building is still maintained. It's part of the charm of the building. So actually the architect, Walter Menteth, left a lot of the building as it is. So the kind of the blown out sort of windows are left as blown out windows, but there's a new layer of glazing placed in front. So somehow the building kind of maintains its history. And these are kind of some of the things that were adopted by artists within the group. And of course, its location and the sort of proximity of sort of corporate London. You can see all around you these sort of, this is, you can see the Shard, the City, and Canary Wharf, all from Southwark Park. So that proximity of London sort of affects the building also.
So just to explain very briefly that the kind of method of the project, between the two of us, we assembled a group of artists, architects, and a choreographer, all who we felt could respond to the building in an interesting way, and wouldn't mind the idea of, rather than in a typical model of a group show where the curator chooses a piece of work to be seen in relation to other already created pieces of work, that people would actually collectively respond together to the building. So it's a slightly different model of a group show. And it's a kind of against all odds collective response to something in that there's so many of us. And we've actually never all been in the same place at the same time. So how do you accomplish this? We kind of devised a method where there was a preliminary exhibition at, as Manojay mentioned, at Camberwell, and a symposium and a couple of little seminars where we could discuss the ideas with students, where invited speakers could talk about the site specifically of Dilston Grove, but also how different disciplines might respond to the site, or what the stakes are within different disciplines in response to site-specific, in creating site-specific work. And so I guess these little things have imposed a bit of pace on us and given us formal opportunities to be in contact with each other, and give us this sort of courage to continue to respond in a way that was very much about the building, and resisting a temptation to show maybe signature set pieces and be more open to what the building was actually saying to us.
Well, I was just going to say, what was interesting in the symposium is that we invited various people, and it was really also a discussion about forms of practice, how we, each of us, might respond, whether we're bringing ourselves or whether we're somehow the space is giving us everything. So that's a kind of question always at the back of our mind is as to that relationship.
And we also tried not to predict, though we come from different disciplines, and we're all responding collectively. There was no pressure to collaborate or to call it necessarily transdisciplinary. They're the sort of words that get thrown around a lot. Multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary. We sort of didn't make any predictions as to how this would develop. And so this is phase 2, and we'll just quickly run through some images before we hear from our speakers. Some installation images.
So a lot of these pieces were just sort of made in this. There was kind of build-up of experiencing the space, but then there's a kind of like a process of actually making within the space through the installation process.
Interestingly, the choreographer decided to design a piece for the outside of the space, going along the red line on the exterior. And this is the private view last week. Okay. Do you want me to click slides?
No, I can probably reach over. Thank you. So, I went to see the exhibition this morning, so I urge you all to go and see it. And in some ways, it's this experience of going to many, many exhibitions over my time as an art critic that's informed the book that I'm going to briefly try and introduce today. That kind of idea that you walk into a space and suddenly you have to make your mind up about whatever is in there very quickly, in my case, in order to be able to write about it. But so the book that I produced is kind of best described as a beginner's insight into contemporary art, but you'll be familiar with this book, John Berger's Ways of Seeing, which is now 44 years old. It was actually first a television series, then became a book. But part of the methodology that John Berger uses is to strip away art history, strip away the kind of the layers of, I guess, what he termed to be not exactly elitism, but he didn't like the idea that there were set ways of viewing pictures, old master pictures. So he broke them down. This is kind of non-theoretical. His methodology was very radical at the time. I mean, obviously we look at it now, it's a 1970s book, so his kind of lenses were feminism and Marxism and consumerism, which we're all sort of much better versed in anyway than we were back then. So, but it did kind of change criticism and commentary forever, and is still a standard book. But what I liked from Berger and what I suppose I've tried to take on in my book was the demystification of art, which he does very successfully in looking at old masters especially. So he talks about seeing coming before words. So the idea that the visual impact is the most important. But he also discusses closing the distance between painting a picture and one's act of looking at it. In this sense, all paintings are contemporary. So, and there's a very sort of kind of scandalous way of presenting a Van Gogh with a caption saying this is the last picture that Van Gogh painted before he killed himself. I mean, it's worth mentioning, in case you haven't seen the book for a while, that it's also full of these mad visual essays and sort of shouty typefaces. It's still a classic book, but anyway, to try and get to the point of what I was doing with my work was not really to redo Berger or do a different version of Berger, because that's not really possible. And that, in fact, the title of my book, which is similar to Ways of Seeing, Ways of Looking, was not my initial choice. It was a kind of compromise with the publishers, but there you go. So I'm sort of stuck with it now. But in a very sort of nutshell kind of way, what I wanted to do was transpose his way of looking at art from the 70s and do the same for contemporary art nowadays, because I didn't feel that, often I get the claim that contemporary art is elitist, or it's only for a certain group, or it's only people in the know, or those who have read the theory understand it, and the rest of us are all left kind of waddling around, not understanding it. So as an art critic, it was always important to be able to quickly, like I said, go in and see an exhibition, try and make sense of it, without necessarily having read about every artist, without necessarily using what art historical knowledge I already had. The idea was to try and give everything a fair shot, if you like. So try and see an exhibition without lots of baggage. And I've always got lots of baggage. I don't like this artist, or I've met this gallery before and I don't like them, or whatever the baggage is, or I've had a bad morning and I've got a headache. So you try and also get rid of that baggage. And that was part of the idea of the book. So, and the fact that we do have so many images nowadays that we're bombarded with, and the rest of that was another reason for it. But perhaps also what's relevant to the discussion and your exhibition is that contemporary art is also increasingly difficult to know where it lies or where the boundary lies. You could be kind of sat in the middle of it. It could be the room you're in. It could be the stuff outside the room. It could be the air inside the room. So there's no particular formula for how to judge what is a work of contemporary art, what is the actual object or the experience we're looking at. So I came to this kind of experiential way of looking at art, the kind of idea of being with it. And so that in some ways is kind of ahistorical. So my book has got no other theorists, no other art historical references in it, which is partly the point. But it's also to empower people to do their own training, their own visual, use their own faculties, which is what Berger was doing in the 70s. The idea being that, you come into this space, you don't know what to make of it. There's screens everywhere, there's rubble, whatever it is, and then you have to use your own wits to make sense of it, and also without kind of recourse to having to read some theory or something, very complicated that people don't understand. So what I came up with was, I don't know the best way to describe it, but it was a bit this idea of coming with a fresh mind, and I used the term tabula rasa as the kind of the blank slate to start from. And that was again because having to see so many exhibitions in my day job that I would kind of have to recalibrate every time that I went to see something else. And the tabula rasa idea led me to a very simple formula for looking at art, which is based on the word tabula and the mnemonic. So each letter, T-A-B-U-L-A, stands for something else. So I'll just rattle through these very quickly as a way of trying to get your head around contemporary art if you don't have any background. So T stands for time, and this was just literally the idea that contemporary art could be something that demanded time of you. So, for example, one of the first works that I mention in the book is Christian Marclay's Clock, which is a 24-hour film composed of clips from films, other films, each with a timepiece or a clock or a station board or Big Ben showing the exact time of day. So the entire 24 hours is accounted for, having sifted through all these different films. So you watch the film, you're also watching a 24-hour clock. So the point of the clock is actually that it's an impossible act of watching, although there was some guy in Canada, some journalist who stayed up for 24 hours with only occasional loo breaks, he said, to watch the whole thing. But the point of it is that not that you're supposed to watch the whole thing. So time is a factor because people don't know how much time to spend. They think, well, how long do I have to spend inside this work? Or perhaps it's a piece of performance that whizzes by you and you don't have time to respond to it. But the first thing you do have to do is give it some time. I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone of walking into a room and deciding I don't like a show and then walking straight out. But the rule here, even though these rules are meant to be broken as well, the rule here is to give something a bit of time and not immediately dismiss it. The next letter in this tabula is A for association, and that's the idea that you can relate to it somehow. So again, this doesn't mean I can relate to it because I've read the correct textbooks or I'm well versed in the subject matter, but it's more about it could be a personal association. So let's see where I went with this. So for example, Jeremy Deller's Stonehenge recreation, which is called Sacrilege, which is a bouncy castle version of Stonehenge. Sort of thing everyone can relate to, either from a Stonehenge point of view, having been there or seen it, it's iconic, or having been on a bouncy castle. So there's an idea here that this is immediately relatable to everyone, and I think Jeremy Deller, as an artist, is good at that, good at picking up on popular pop culture references or whatever it is. But so that's the A, is for association, for something that you can grasp onto, which doesn't necessarily have to be anything too complicated. The B stands for background. So the background here is, yes, you might have to read a little bit of something about this work, or you might have to understand why it was made or who made it. So it could be as little as knowing that the artist is Chinese, his name is Ai Weiwei, and these are ancient some dynasty pots, which he then dips into industrial paint. So very quickly, just by having a little bit of background, you start to understand the context, and you know what you're looking at, rather than just staring at the pots blankly. So there's some occasions where you do need, to go through, if you're going through this process, to understand a little bit more about the artist. And then U is for understand. So I suppose, that there is a moment where you've been through a process, you've sat there for a little while, you've thought about the work, and you may have read enough to understand a little bit about it. And then, for example, I've chosen this piece, which is Thomas Demand, who creates photographs from paper sculptures that he makes. So these are life-size sculptures made of paper or cardboard, which he then photographs and usually destroys the sculpture element of it. So you get the idea that this is a photograph of a sculpture, of a three-dimensional object, but it's also of a real photograph, and the photograph in this situation was the control room of the nuclear power plant in Fukushima. So very quickly, with a little bit of background and sort of a line or two about it, you get the first sense of what it is to understand. And then the last couple of letters here, we have look again, and the idea being, again, this sort of came from being an art critic, that you sort of often led to believe that your first thought is the correct thought about whatever it is. You've made your mind up and that's it. But quite often there is a sort of moment of reflection or doubling back, as it were, which I often use sort of, I suppose all of this is unconscious or subconscious, but we can talk about that a bit later. And then the assessment. Now, the interesting thing about this in my book is that I don't aim to make assessments in the book, because that, as an art critic, that's what I'm constantly being asked to do. How many stars is this? Is it good or not? But the point of the book is to let everyone else do their own assessment. So by the time you've got through this process, you should have come to some conclusion. Yes, I've spent a bit of time, I've understood it to a certain extent. I now feel comfortable in making my own judgment. I don't have to believe what it is I've read about it, or I don't have to listen to my friend who's telling me how terrible it is. You can make up your own mind. So that's the sort of the point of the book. I suppose this might be, I've missed this out, this was a good example of looking again, which was a piece by Thomas Hirschhorn of someone swiping through pictures on an iPad and sort of blowing them up and swiping them away. But they're kind of these horrific images of war and death that the artist found on the internet. And the idea to kind of look at this again was, yes, it's a horrific video, if you like, but the casual nature by which this woman sweeps through these images also had this kind of secondary effect on me. You know, it made me stick around and look at the video and try and understand what it was that made me feel so kind of guilty, because I suppose we see these images and we get used to storing them away, or we get used to the idea that they exist. So anyway, that was just an example of looking again. And in terms of assessment, again, the book's not meant to be didactic in that sense, because one of the most mysterious works I saw recently was this piece in Documenta by Pierre Huyghe, which is essentially, I mean, it's called Untilled rather than Untitled, so the land is kind of untilled. But it was in the middle of a park, a bit of a wasteland with all these shrubs and things and marijuana plants being grown, a dog with a pink leg, and a statue of a woman with a beehive on her head. So it's one of these kind of moments where you're trying to make sense of it all. But, you know, part of the book is the idea that you're not meant to make sense of it all. It's not necessarily the aim, but I do go into sort of how important that is, that idea of whether you can make your mind up about it or not. So, how long do I have left? I might just give you a very quick kind of road test of one of these, how this might actually work using this tabular formula. So I picked an artist, Carsten Holler, who I spoke to yesterday, who's actually building some of these slides outside the Hayward Gallery this summer. So he's creating a similar idea to the Tate Modern, but this time there will be 2 slides exiting the building. But I'm just going to read you a little bit from the book about how this might work with the tabular formula. So, taking my own advice on how to read vexing or potentially dangerous works of art, I clear my mind and invoke the tabula rasa set of rules. T stands for time, something these slides don't seem to require a lot of. In fact, a few seconds is all it takes to deposit each entrant from top to bottom. But instead of heading down the long dark tunnel, I spend a few minutes descending the stairs through the various levels of Tate Modern, finding 5 sets of stainless steel slides in total, all combining and intertwining with the building to create a pleasing sculptural network of pipes. The A for association is easy. Everyone can relate to the childhood thrill with playgrounds and their promise of unadulterated delight. Subconsciously, I'm sure that before I chickened out of the queue at the top, I'd relived a moment of vertigo anxiety that went straight back to an exceptionally tall and steep slide that I'd eventually conquered as a boy, which briefly came back to me as a heartening memory. Such personal, seemingly inconsequential anecdotes can still be as valid as any intellectual or aesthetic responses, and can colour or enhance the enjoyment of a work of art accordingly. In this case, any negative associations I had with roller coasters and the like were tempered by the possibility of conquering my fear of heights, the slides actually offering me a chance at some kind of therapeutic, even cathartic redemption. Now for the B, the background to Holler's installation and the title Test Site. Carsten Holler is a Belgian artist, but he lives in Stockholm. He trained as an entomologist in Germany and studying bugs, and he soon gained notoriety as an artist for his mind-bending situations, perception-altering installation, and for the slides, one of which deposited Miuccia Prada out of her office down to her car outside. But since this Tate commission, Holler has produced many more kind of funhouse installations and exhibitions, such as Amusement Park from 2006, which featured abnormally slow bumper cars and carousels wearing away ominously, or Experience of 2011, which led New Yorkers on a magical mystery tour through the new museum via slides, hallucinogenic light shows, an offer of a love drug, and even a session in a flotation tank. So in order to attempt the next letter in the sequence U and gain a rudimentary understanding of Holler's strange yet enjoyable art, it was time for me to take the plunge. Having read and listened to his description of the slides as being like a barely controlled fall, or how vertigo imposes a voluptuous panic upon an otherwise lucid mind, it was hard not to feel like a test subject myself, doing the artist's behavioral bidding like a caged rat in some sinister sociological laboratory. But this may simply be my aversion to being told what to do or how to respond by these pulse-quickening rides or pupil-dilating tricks. These nagging prejudices against Holler's work means I should quickly invoke the L and look again, or in my case, stop putting it off and get onto one of those infernal slides. And I barely have time to yell tabula rasa as I bucket down one of the silvery flumes and puddle onto the turbine hall floor alongside my fellow tube travellers. So finally comes the A for assessment, my snap judgment as a guinea pig, being spat out of this art experiment as one of sheer adrenaline-fueled joy, despite initial fears and misgivings about his cold scientific motives. There's no doubt that Test Site was hugely entertaining in a physical, visceral, nerve-jangling way that had little to do with the usual museum-going experience, which is so often confined to merely visual or cerebral enjoyment. High cultural snobbery aside, is there anything actually wrong with appreciating art first and foremost on this most base, primal, gut-churning level? So that's a kind of run-through of how it might or might not work. I mean, time is obviously not really a factor in this work, but later on in the book, and I think what might be useful for our discussion today, is talking about art as spectacle. And I'm sure this feeds into Jane's work, and increasingly some of the work between art and architecture is the sense in which we are being wowed or made to feel that an art experience is somehow, or we expect our art experiences increasingly to be awe-inspiring or somehow, something that we experience. So a lot of this book is about these kind of experiential works of art. They're all from the last 10 or so years, but that doesn't mean they don't exist previously. And there are some other examples here, the Harrier and Jaguar from Tate Modern, and Subodh Gupta's work also from the Tate Britain. And yeah, I mean, that's it. I talk about, works of art that I believe people have seen or come into contact with. So Martin Creed's Lights Going On and Off. And I end rather strangely with another homage to John Berger with Rembrandt, almost as an idea of it coming full circle, but also the idea that it's not just contemporary art that can benefit from this sort of technique. So that's it. Thanks. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I was suddenly worried on the way here as an architectural historian that I might be asked all kinds of questions about the history of the church. So I'm very happy that you covered that for me. And Ossian, that's fantastic. I really want to get your book. Is it out already? Yeah, I think what you're doing there is actually incredibly elegant and deceptively simple. You've managed to, I think, get to the heart of many things, but you're expressing it in a very lucid and clear way. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. I think when we get on to some of what I'm going to talk about, maybe I fit under A, the first A, but I'm not sure. But it definitely touches on, I think, this issue of what our expectation of art is, actually, and how one judges it. And also, which I'll probably talk a bit about at the end, how I think looking again is perhaps one of the most important aspects of site-specific work, actually. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and for making such an interesting and fascinating exhibition, which I went to see last weekend. And I might talk a little bit about the context of what I've been doing in the weeks around that and why I've perhaps focused on certain images of certain works there. But I found the show really entrancing. And I think many of the works frame the building in a really interesting way. So I was sort of expecting a lot of the building to frame the works, but actually what I found happening was the other way round in many ways.
the way that the show's been installed allows you to see the building a bit differently, or brings out certain things in the building that I thought was fascinating. What I'd like to do is what I want to do is, for me, I don't feel ready to go through and discuss each of the works in the show. I do definitely want to do a piece of writing that responds to 63 millimetres. Quite excited about what a 63 millimetre piece of writing might be. But I don't feel ready to go through and talk about each of the works, but hopefully we might be able to do that in discussion. What I thought I might do is just reflect a little bit about some kind of maybe different thematics around site specificity, and in doing so talk a bit about my own work, partly as a commentator on art and architecture, but partly also through reference to the first site-specific piece of writing that I made, and kind of what happened in that process in order to draw out some themes. So maybe the first theme might be the way I've been thinking about the relationship between art and architecture, and specifically practices that cross that space between art and architecture. Actually, this book was never meant to be called, maybe a bit like your book, Art and Architecture. It's actually meant to be called Critical Spatial Practice, but the publisher said no one would know what that meant. She might have been right, I don't know. But so I was a little bit disappointed with the title, because what I was trying to think about was this idea of what I was calling critical spatial practice. And I suppose for me, the first time that I really started to think about the processes and practices that cross over between art and architecture actually came through teaching. So my background is as an architectural designer, practiced for a number of years, and then started doing architectural history. And in that process, got invited to teach on and run a program, an MA, on what was called the Theory and Practice of Public Art, but really it was about site-specific practice. And so it was actually through working with students from a whole range of backgrounds. Some actually weren't creative practitioners, that some were urban policy makers. Others were landscape architects, interior designers, fine artists, community practitioners, thinking about what it meant to make work in so-called public spaces, but work that responded to specific sites, and how that work might draw out different kinds of formal, material, social, historical issues around sites. And I guess for me, it made me think a lot, coming from an architectural background that had a particular kind of training in the 80s around site. We would never really talk about site specificity, we might talk about context, but in quite a formal way, to do with perhaps aspect, weather, geometric qualities, let's say, or even geological qualities of site, but to really deal with conceptual, political issues, for me, I found really interesting in art practice, and also perhaps bringing in associative things, which in architecture would, at that time, I think architecture training has gone in a very different direction since then, but mine was a very kind of modernist sort of sub-corp type training, although there was some social issues in it. So while I was involved in, closely involved in teaching site-specific art, I started thinking about that practice in this book, Art and Architecture, thinking about practices that operate between disciplines. I think at the time I was thinking of interdisciplinarity. Now I would more likely talk about transdisciplinarity, but in a way, perhaps that becomes semantic. I'm not sure. I think there are conceptual and quite important theoretical differences, but maybe I'm not sure how important that is to practitioners. And I think that work now is much more about moving between disciplines rather than being too caught up in whether you come from here, here, or here, but what it means to find a place that allows you to operate across them. I was also really interested in the relation of theory and practice. I still am. And I was particularly interested in critical theory. In architecture, quite often theory might be a way of applying an idea to practice, or analysing a practice, sometimes to fit with a certain theoretical idea. But I was much more taken with, maybe a little bit old-fashioned now, but I'm still quite a fan of Marxist critical theory. and the idea that that brings self-reflection into play and also social emancipation. And so I was really interested in the idea of site specificity as potentially a form of critical spatial practice, one that allowed the process of work to be brought to the fore, the self-reflectivity, but also for me, I know this isn't the same for all practitioners, but also the idea of social critique. So I started defining critical spatial practice as something where someone might intervene into a site in order to critique that site, and also a way of drawing attention to aspects of the site's history, specific qualities of the site. I was also became very interested in the idea of site specificity, and this was reading Hal Foster's work, going beyond the physical location of a work and engaging with issues around ethnography, performativity, and in that very famous essay of Hal Foster's In Return of the Real, I think he talks about self-critique, context, alterity, and interdisciplinarity relating to kind of site-specific practice. And just sort of show some brief moments. I wasn't able to photograph all the works in the show because I think some of them, and I'll come to this in a while, didn't lend themselves so well to photographic documentation, whereas other things did. And at other moments I wasn't sure whether I was looking at a work or the building, which I really, really enjoyed. So I was trying to find the choreographic score or drawing at this point and wondering kind of where it was. And that led me to a very, very close examination of the wall, which I really enjoyed. So I was also thinking, when I was thinking about this relation between art and architecture, Mi Hong Kwon's book, One Place After Another. And she points in that book to Omi Baba's idea of relational specificity, which is a little bit like James Clifford's idea of site as a mobile place that might be located between fixed points. So I started being interested in sites, not only specific sites, but relations between sites, and in a way, the configuration that one might make through site-specific work to other sites, not just the site that you're working in, but other sites that maybe are brought to mind associatively, and create these kind of circuits, perhaps of connection and often disconnection. And I felt this happening quite a lot when I was in the show, particularly with the 63 millimeter piece. I've been working a lot at the moment on the Aylesbury estate. I live on the other side of the Old Kent Road from Southwark Park, in an estate near the Aylesbury. And in that estate at the moment, people are being displaced and moved on. The estate's being regenerated, tenants and leaseholders are losing their homes. I've been working a lot with them through the public inquiry and trying to challenge that decision. Why wasn't the estate refurbished rather than demolished? And in that process, becoming just so aware of the advance of kind of the city into South London and the flow of capital across the river, if you like, and what that's producing in terms of displacement. So I was really fascinated by Ian's work, bringing to mind in that space in South London, and you showed that lovely image looking across the river of the city. And I don't know if everyone's seen the show, but this is a work which is this 63 millimeter section through a speculative office space, 2 stories. I don't know if the artist's here. Is the artist here? I don't know. Hi. Yeah, very, very inspired by your piece, I have to say. So brought that space of kind of commodity capital into the room for me, into the church, and made it very live. But I was also really taken with this idea, which I think Maraj expresses really beautifully. I just want to read from his piece, Ascension, about how a work that's in one site can bring to mind another site. I hope you don't mind if I just read from your writing. I can almost see Dilston Grove from my living room window, Southwark Park from Wapping looking south, a horizon of trees and expanse of sky punctuated by the ever-towering Maydew House reaching vertically. The former mission church sits low and horizontal near the tower hidden by plane trees. The park lies under main flight paths, aeroplanes ascending and descending towards Heathrow in the west and City Airport in the east. And I did wonder a lot about Mayhew House and whether that's under a demolition order. But I think Southwark have a plan to put 4 new stories on top. 6, yeah. Yes, well. So I won't go through all these pieces, just give people a flavour of the show. So it brought to mind, which I suppose has always been, it's a terrible image, I apologise for it, but a very important starting point for me in thinking about site-specific work was the work of Robert Smithson, but particularly his idea of site and non-site. And I'm sure many of you know, but where the origination, if you like, of that idea for him came for a time when he was working as a consultant artist with an architectural firm on different designs for Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. And this was a project that alerted him to thinking about ways of working outside the gallery. So he was interested in what would happen if there was a work made on the runway, but also that work was somehow documented inside the terminal building for passengers to experience another version of the work on the inside. So was quite taken by this idea of a work that might exist in 2 different sites at the same time. And this kind of latter documentation of the work, what he called the non-site, he sets up as in terms of a dialogue, which I thought was really interesting. He says, I was sort of interested in the dialogue between the indoor and the outdoor. I developed a method or dialectic that involved what I call site and non-site, and so I decided I would set limits in terms of this dialogue. And perhaps, maybe this is debatable, but perhaps his first non-site piece is this piece of work here, a non-site Pine Barrens, New Jersey from 1969. And this consisted of bins filled with sand taken from the runways of a little used wilderness airfield laid out in hexagonal pattern in the gallery, along with a photostat map and a text that read, 31 subdivisions based on a hexagonal airfield in the Woodmansea Quadrangle, New Jersey topographic map. Each subdivision of the non-site contains sand from the site shown on the map. Tours between the non-site and site are possible. The red dot on the map is the place where the sand was collected. So this thinking about how sites can be connected, disconnected through site-specific practice is something that I've been working kind of more with. And I just wanted to present a short extract from a piece of work that starts off as a response to another artwork. So it's an extract from an essay that's called To Miss the Desert, and it was written in response to a work by Nathan Coley called Black Tent from 2003, which was a site-specific work curated by Gavin Wade for a show, Art and Sacred Spaces, and happened to be also in a church space. Around the edge, the bathroom has a floor of polished marble, black, interwoven with white veins. Perched on the toilet with her feet dangling off the ground, she traces the white lines with her gaze. She keeps alert for cockroaches. At any time, one might crawl through the cracks around the edge of the room and into the blackness. 14 floor finishes, location G6, lay new flooring 300mm by 300mm, terracotta, unglazed tiles with sandstone colour grout, 10mm wide joints. All tiles to be laid out from centre line, finished floor level to match G5. All the floors are marble, smooth and cool, laid out in careful grids, except for the big golden rug next to the sofa. She likes to follow its intricate patterns with her feet like paths around a secret garden. But if you dance around the edges of the squares, you mustn't be silly enough to fall in. Who knows what could lie in wait for you in an enchanted garden? Along one edge of her garden are a number of small rooms. These are home to Ghulam and Kareem. Ghulam is tall and fair-skinned with light hair and green eyes, and Kareem shorter, stockier, with darker hair, skin and eyes. They fought each other in the past, and they'll fight again when the Soviets come to Kabul, and then again when her own people search the Hindu Kush to wipe out all evil. But for now, there's no fighting. Once the sun has gone down, they sit and eat together. He's a man with property and wives. Inside the walls of his house are sunlit orchards with trees full of dark purple fruit. A group of women, dressed in different shades of red, watch them arrive. Some have covered their faces, but she can still see pink nail varnish on their toes, and as her family draws closer, the women disappear. 14 floor finishes, location 1.5 and G5. 4-bow lino sheeting, 1.5 mil, to be laid on 6 mil WBP ply subfloor. Ply and lino to run under appliances and around kitchen units, colour TBA by client. Aluminium threshold at junction with G2, G6 and 1.1. They sit upstairs in a long veranda overlooking the garden. The only furniture is a carpet laid out in a line down the middle of the room. Important men from the village, all in turbans, sit cross-legged around the edges of the carpet and eat from the dishes laid out between them. Her mother, her sister and herself are the only women. And as they walk back down through the dark house to leave, she sees a pair of eyes watching her from behind a screen. The eyes belong to a girl with the hands of a woman who glints with silver. Later she learns this is Kareem's youngest wife, once a nomad, who carries her wealth in the jewels on her fingers. So this was a highly associative piece of writing in response to Nathan's Black Tent. And fortunately for me, the curator, Gavin Wade, had done the critic's work of all the other letters in your tabula rasa, and that left me the rather nice position of being able to do something a little bit more associative. So Black Tent had developed out of Nathan Coley's interest in religious structures, but specifically the evocative and very precise description of the construction of the tabernacle given in the Bible. And I don't know if any of you know that description. I'm not a religious person myself, but it is an exquisite architectural specification of how to build a tabernacle. Very, very evocative piece of writing. So Gavin had read a piece of my writing where I questioned whether it was possible to write architecture rather than write about architecture. And so he asked me to write a tabernacle, which was quite a challenge. And luckily, one that I was able to refuse, because I felt that the text in the Bible had already done that job. But what I set for myself as a brief, if you like, with my architectural training, was how to write Black Tent, how to respond to this artwork. So it consists of a flexible structure. Maybe this is background now. A number of steel-framed panels with black fabric screens stretched upon them. Small coloured squares and transparent windows crisscrossed with stitching are inserted into the screens. And the piece Black Tent moved to a number of different sites in the town of Portsmouth, including 2 in the cathedral, so it was reconfigured within the cathedral, and then a shopping centre, a school, and a public park as well. So the essay that I wrote tried to echo aspects of Black Tent. I was very interested in the differing configuration of the panels depending on their situation. So each section of the essay, I've only read one this evening, but each section of the essay is composed around a different spatial condition, such as around the edge. And what I tried to do in a way through the essay was more an analogy to the physical work. So trying to explore through writing some of the same thematics, the nature of boundary conditions, which is something that I continue to be fascinated by. In fact, the book I'm working on now on transitional spaces is about boundaries, whether they're political, personal, material, psychic. What I was trying to do was parallel Nathan's interest in this bounded site of the religious sanctuary, and I suppose this is where the work of the critic comes in. Even in trying to, let's say, remake his work in writing, decisions creep in. Even the most simple act of mimesis, if you like, in my view, will always be an act of interpretation. So in trying to kind of remake Black Tent in words, one of the things that I was particularly wanting to critique, if you like, was his focus on Judeo-Christian traditions. And so I was much more interested in my writing on the secular sanctuary of home, but also bringing in other religions, particularly Islamic religions. So what I also tried to do in the writing was respond to some of the formal qualities in the work. So I tried to set up a narrative that had two sides, like the square. I suppose now I would also be interested perhaps in a four-cornered piece of writing. I don't quite know how that would be, but at the time I was thinking about two sides. So I have these two voices in the piece. One is a childhood voice, much more intimate, about a childhood spent in various nomadic cultures and countries in the Middle East. The other voice is more public, you might say, more professional, and it takes specifications that I wrote when I was designing contemporary sanctuaries for different minority women and ethnic groups when I worked in a practice called Matrix, which some people in the room know well, in the 90s. So it was a mixture of associative writing based on memory and then taking these already existing pieces of writing, architectural specifications, and kind of montaging them. What happened next, which has become a kind of part of my practice, I think, as a writer now, was that I was involved in a project called Spatial Imagination, which was a group project with about 14 artists, architects, and designers working together over the period of a year. We had some funding at the time. There was a bit more arts and humanities funding around, and we had some funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council to design a prototype. That didn't quite happen, but we did make a catalogue and exhibition of work around the idea of spatial imagination in design, critiquing the idea that it's simply creativity is kind of jolly and fun. In fact, one person did a work about issues of paranoia and surveillance, the paranoid imagination. So it was a very interesting year that we worked together around the spatial imagination. I'm not going to talk about all the works. This is just a glimpse of a view of the exhibition, which was held in the Domo Bal Gallery, not far from here. Very similar architectural space, but a domestic space with the first floor, which is a gallery. Some of you may know it. I'll just briefly touch on the work that I made. So this was where I took the essay that I'd written to Miss the Desert, and I reconfigured it into 12 small scenes to match the architectural composition of the window, which was the space I chose to work in the gallery, partly because of my interest in transitional spaces. So the piece of work that I made was in two sites, if you like. One was in the catalogue that went along with the show, that's the excerpt from that, and the other was in the window. And what I did in the window was took a black eyeliner and wrote the word purda in, it's in Purda's Persian, but it's actually in an Arabic script from Dari, which is the main language. There are two languages mainly spoken in Afghanistan, Pashto and Dari, and Dari's the more, at the time, when I was living in Afghanistan as a child, the more kind of formal language. So I wrote the word purda across the screen. I wanted to respond to the west-facing window of the gallery because it's a transitional space. It faces towards, what I wanted to create was a shadow of the letters forming a rug on the floor of the gallery. And it responded to various childhood memories. This is me, very tiny, age of 2, in a transitional space at the gate of my house in El Fasher in Darfur. And this is an image that I was always fascinated by in my mum and dad's collection of the house we lived in Kabul. That's not there anymore, but the neighbours looking back at our house. I was also very interested in rugs, particularly this kind of rug, which is an enzi, which isn't just a floor rug, it also becomes a doorway in nomadic cultures in northern Afghanistan. I'm not going to go into all the details of the piece. I think all I really want to talk about, I was very interested in purda. at the time I was making the work was the time of the Iraq War, and I was very interested in how one of the justifications for going to war in Afghanistan was to unveil women, and it was a critique of the Taliban. I don't endorse the veiling of women and the behaviour of the Taliban, but I did find it very interesting that this was an argument that was used. The unveiling of women was required in order to kind of justify an act of going to war, and became very interested in the work of Leila Ahmed around veiling, and how what she says is that veiling, in a way, the aim of unveiling women in order to liberate from the repression has operated as the mode of justification for one patriarchal culture to possess another. So this was a very political interest that I had, but I think there were also other things that happened in the work. For example, I really wanted this shadow of the writing to come onto the floor of the gallery, to form a kind of rug on the floor. I have to say, again, this is the first site-specific work I ever made. That didn't happen because I'd got the angle of the sun wrong. It was January. There was not enough sunlight for that to happen. So other things happened. Creation of a kind of curtain effect, and purdah also means curtain. So I was really interested in the unexpected things that happened. And also, I hadn't really thought about what it meant to write publicly and to stand in the window space and write against the window, which started at early-ish morning, continuing on until nighttime. And actually, I started to realise that actually what I was doing was more interesting as a performance piece, perhaps, than the finished piece, but I'd never planned how to document the work. So the only documentation I have of me making it is this piece, which a friend passing took because they were amazed that I was still working on it when everyone else had gone home. So this was a really interesting experience for me. I think if I was to remake that work, I would like to at some point, I probably wouldn't make it in an art gallery. I would want to make it in a site, perhaps opposite the American Embassy would have been a more fitting site for it at the time. But it certainly alerted me to, I think, the really interesting things that happen when you make a work in a place, and the unexpected things that can occur. I think what also happened while I was writing the art and architecture book was and I think it's probably apparent from what I've been talking about here, and these kind of quite long, drawn-out relationships that I have with a piece of work. This is probably still, I'm thinking about Nathan Coley's Black Tent, and this is maybe 5 years later, finally, and still thinking about that work and what it meant, and revisiting it in my mind. And I started to think that was kind of strange to think about criticism as something that isn't a practice itself. So I started to think about art criticism as a practice, and started to think how odd it was to not think about criticism as site-specific, because in a way criticism does have sites, and criticism is somehow implicated in those sites in some ways. How can criticism have no site? How can it not be situated? And I think when you're describing the Carsten Holler piece, that was really interesting as a way into your site-specific experience of that work. So in a way, another theme perhaps we could talk about, although I don't know people here are artists, practitioners or writers, or both, how to write about site-specific work. So I started to think more about this idea of site writing as a practice of writing sites, and the idea that criticism is a form of situated practice in some ways, and that the changing sites that the critic might occupy, emotional as well as conceptual, might be performed as critical attitudes in some way. So was thinking a lot about Claire Bishop's writing, and she talks about, in her book on installation art, she talks about the degree of proximity between model subject and literal viewer, which I find quite interesting. She talks about that as a criterion of aesthetic judgment for installation art. But although she does refer in passing to processes of writing criticism and perhaps the implications of not experiencing the work firsthand, she doesn't necessarily talk so much about the critic as one of those viewing subjects, and that's really something that I wanted to pick up on and started to think about the responsibility that a critic might have to interpret and perform the work for another audience, and that in doing so, the critic's choosing to occupy a series of positions or sites as some kind of mediator between the artwork and the audience. That may be quite obvious to a very well-trained art critic, but coming at this from as an architectural historian, that was a moment of revelation for me in some ways. And so I started thinking about the performance of an interpretive role, and repositioning the artwork as a site in some way, a site to respond to. And I was also very taken by Howard Cagle's writing, his writing around Walter Benjamin, and the idea of immanent critique that he talks about, where the criteria of critical judgment can be discovered or invented in the course of criticism. And it feels like you're talking about something quite similar, but in a more accessible way, perhaps. And also the idea of strategic critique, which I'm particularly taken with because in the way that Cagle describes it, it's coming from Kant, but it's very, very spatial. So he talks about strategic critique moving between the work and its own externality. Not sure I've still understood what that means. Situating the work in the context of experience and in its turn being situated by it. And I've also been quite inspired by a whole number of critics coming out of performance studies. Gavin Butt's work, again, around the idea of an immanent critique and the performative act of critical engagement itself. And then from a really wonderful book by Amelia Jones and Andrew Stevenson, a sentence that has been really key for me. So they're taking issue with the tradition that the interpreter must be neutral or disinterested in the objects which he or she judges. They posit instead that processes of viewing and interpreting involve what they call entanglement in intersubjective spaces of desire, projection, and identification. And this was the key sentence for me. Interpretation, like the production of works of art, is a mode of communication. Meaning is a process of engagement and never dwells in one place. So I really liked, as an architect and spatial practitioner, the idea of interpretation and meaning dwelling in place. And I think this idea of how site specificity might put kind of pressure. I started thinking a lot when I was in the church about acupuncture and about how works might put kind of pressure points on the site that kind of change the energy of the site in some way. And perhaps rather than close it down, I think sometimes people think of site specificity as something that the specific closes down. But I think why I find acupuncture an interesting way of thinking about site specificity is it actually opens up and transforms and changes things. And I found that the work was doing that. It wasn't closing down the meanings of the church in any way. It was actually opening up to all kinds of other passages of thought for me. And I think also perhaps maybe I'm near the last of my themes, I hope, might be around temporality. So, you know, I've been very aware that in the work that I've done, I've been very, very focused on spatiality. Perhaps it's the architectural training. And I think it was actually in a teaching session when a student said to me, well, how can you think about space without time? That's impossible. Yeah, of course, of course, that's absolutely right. So it started me thinking in a way about the temporality of site specificity. And I was involved in a show called One Day Sculpture that was curated by Claire Doherty and David Cross in New Zealand several years ago. And the idea was that each artist would make a work that lasted one day, but a sculpture, not an event, a sculpture, but a one-day sculpture. And I started to think, what happens when time comes to the fore rather than space? So we've seen this whole turn to spatial theory that happened in the early 90s and that the importance of space in the postmodern period. I think more recently there's been this kind of revalorization of the relational and the performative. And they're both terms that I think one can't theorize or practice without reference to time. And perhaps these critical thematics become features of what's being called the performative turn. There are always lots of different turns, so I suppose it depends what turn you prefer. I'm quite happy at the moment in the performative turn, but that might change again. But I think for me, noticing time, certainly for myself, again, has huge implications for thinking about spatial practice because, of course, practice is a process. It's nothing if not time-based. To practice is a verb. Verbs are words of action. They take place over time. So I suppose this is something, you know, Ed Soja talked many years ago, he's a geographer, about the need for the reassertion of space into social theory. And it feels to me like in my own work, certainly, I want to kind of reassert time into critical spatial practice and to then start thinking about all of time's modalities, flow, flux, duration, ephemerality, event, and to start thinking about perhaps the time of apprehending a work, how long it takes to come to terms with a work, perhaps never, perhaps very fast. And so this is something perhaps would be interesting to talk about. And the other thing perhaps, so I think I should probably end here, but the other theme that I wanted to also perhaps talk about was in a group show, how does one work with each other? How does one find space for one's own work within the space of working with other people? And how does that kind of evolve over time? I'd personally be fascinated to hear about that. Okay, so I'm there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you both for really wonderful talks. I mean, I think that there's a lot of, I think you kind of touched on a lot of things that we've kind of been talking about, and we sort of wanted to start off with a few questions for ourselves to kind of open it up. Perhaps Kelly, you had some questions. So,
well, the first one I had was really about the group show and the expectations that you have going to a group show, and everyone kind of thinking they know what it is. It's almost like the mixtape. How do you put the right songs together to make the perfect mixtape when we still use cassette tapes or playlists? But we set out to treat the space not just as subject, but also as studio or lab. And so if you're practicing the space, then the nature of the outcomes is a lot more unpredictable. And so the harrowing thing about assembling the work in the space and creating a group show was that we didn't quite know what we were getting. And then the negotiation of how you would place the works in the space was one that had to be done rather spontaneously with a little bit of a notion of what we were getting.
I have to say it's a process of evolution, actually, because one is that it was actually it's a question I have about how whether we bring something to a place and are we kind of acting out what we already know within a space, or is there such a, obviously you kind of mentioned about tabula rasa, and is there such a thing? Is it always that there's an engagement with what we're bringing to a space, and then there's that dialogue that happens between those kind of, I can call it a substance, that we have with the substance of the space, and I think in terms of the group show, that brings another sort of dimension to the mix. So then not only are you kind of reacting with the space yourself, but you're also reacting with other people. And I think that dialogue was constantly happening, and it's kind of, a lot of it's conversational.
But that question I wrote down, can you have a tabula rasa when making? To try and clear the slate and go, I'm going to respond differently than I would normally just making work in isolation.
Well, I mean, if you want, I can't really offer you a particularly unbiased critique of the whole show right now, but What I would say about the way you tackled the group show, I mean, how do you judge a group show? It's either too homogenous, like that everything's too similar, or it's too varied, everything's too all over the place. But I think actually the variety that you have alighted upon, whether that's because of your different collaborators, architects and choreographers and all the rest of it, it seems like there's enough going on in all these different spheres that the works talk to each other in an interesting way. They're not homogenous, and you know, if you're talking about, it's also difficult to talk about a group show that's made specific to the site, because I often find with site-specific works, it's difficult to say when one succeeds or not, but if you're talking about big public works, I sometimes find that the ones that are too site-specific are the ones that tend to fail. So if it's so rooted in that space because they've done lots of research about that particular thing, and it's so specific to that community or that thing, that actually if you took it out of that space it would have no relevance whatsoever, or you would just think, well, that's totally, you know, it sort of narrows the work of art down. Whereas I felt that a lot of the objects in your show felt like they could stand alone or stand apart, meant that they were doing their job better than just being site-specific, just responding to the space, because I feel like that's perhaps the wrong way to go when you're making a site-specific thing, that you go so specific that everyone's just like, yeah, I get it, it's about this building. But I felt like you avoided that somehow.
And I was glad that you felt like the works, what was the order? And when you, the building didn't frame the works, but the works framed the building and seemed to open things up. And I think the other thing that we were conscious of is the history of shows in that space that have tended to kind of turn their back on the building, close the windows, build the walls, and create something using the height of the space maybe, but not really allowing the space into the work, which we felt was really important, that we didn't cover up the amazing walls, that they were there, kind of having a conversation with the work. Yeah.
That's right. It didn't feel too full. There was enough room to breathe in it. But I also think it's interesting in a group show, well, you two were the curators, or did you? Yeah. So that whole issue of at what point you make a decision that fixes the fluidity, and where as people are evolving works at different rates and wanting to respond to different parts of the site, how you come up with, in a way, that the configuration that works for everyone. That, I mean, certainly when we were involved in spatial imagination, that was one of the most difficult decisions. Luckily, everyone found their kind of nook, and there wasn't a kind of fight over, oh, we both want to be at the window or something. But I think that's quite an intricate set of decisions to make. It's quite a sensitivity that's required, especially when you're both making works yourself within the space.
There was a kind of constant dialogue that was being had. I mean, I think we were, in a way, I feel kind of privileged to have been in a position where we were sort of coordinating, because the conversations that certainly it kind of fed into my work. I mean, it's like, I think that the conversations that, you know, it's like, Issam, I had a kind of conversation with about his work, but you know, it's like there's a sort of, you know, a kind of nice position where you're kind of getting all this information in, but then you're kind of having to work out where things are going to be placed, but then you can kind of put people together and say, well, actually, you guys there's similarities between what you're doing. Yeah. So I think that, and then also, you know, like for the sort of the collaborative element. Ian collaborated with Aisha on a piece.
Yeah.
Certainly, I had lots of conversation. I mean, one wasn't forced to collaborate. I mean, I think one of the early sort of conversations we had was, should we have a format? Should there be a sort of set of rules that we can kind of follow? And we sort of went away from that idea, because we thought that actually the building is the rule. Somehow, you know, the building has a set of rules. It has a set of values that it will kind of then start to speak to us individually. I think that's crucial.
It's already the brief, isn't it? Or it's already the thing that holds everything way, which
Yes.
is different from a group show in a white cube type of space.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
you'll find that actually some pieces are kind of referring to the body. So Foster's piece is all about the volume of the body in relation
Yeah.
to the space and how that becomes something that kind of moves through the space. You know, and yeah, I mean, Aisha's piece is about geometry.
Yeah.
And you know, so these are things that sort of are kind of woven into the building that then starts to get teased out individually. And I think that people kind of play off each other as well.
But it also seemed really important to have those elements within the show that were durational. So having the audio work I found really interesting because it kept changing my experience of the space and refiguring the relation of the works, but also the choreographic piece outside as well. So it kind of punctuates the show in a way, which I found really interesting.
I was just a very basic question, but it was about the differences between architecture and art, assuming that many people in the audience here come from architecture. Because architects always work site-specifically, and I'm just kind of curious about the problem of working site-specifically and what that kind of means for people. Is it a question that I've just asked? I'm not sure.
Well,
but
it's interesting in terms of what's next door with the British Pavilion from last year's Architecture Biennial. In that, I mean, I learned a lot going around the Architecture Biennial last year about how to put on shows, and I think all the people from last week's Venice Biennial could all learn a lot by going to next year's Architecture Biennial and vice versa. I think that I don't know whether architecture as a practice works like that, but if you're talking about putting on an exhibition, I think that the format of an architecture exhibition can radically inform what an art exhibition could or should be. And that's partly to do with the use of space, partly to be able to, you know, if you're constrained by the amount of objects you can have, it's hard to have real architecture in another architectural space. So you're working with models or graphics or whatever it might be, but you're also using that space much better. I often feel that the artists just come in and go, yeah, here's a bit of space, I'm going to put my new work in it, and boom, I'm finished. But the architects and the pavilions, I found, you know, are much more sensitively arranged and considered in terms of flow and you know, public, rather than, you know, I might be slightly generalising here. The artists would probably all be screaming, no, we spent ages thinking about that, but you know, it seemed to me like in terms of putting on an exhibition, I could say that yes, the architects could inform the artists in that way.
That's interesting. I suppose I would. My foremost thought was really more to do with the process of design, and that in general there would be exceptions to this, but when an architect approaches a site, there's usually some kind of program or brief client in mind, and so there's a sort of pragmatic, maybe it's being conceptualized already, but there's an element of a kind of demand that's coming with the response to a site. And I think perhaps when a fine artist approaches a site with a site-specific work, there's not that same demand of program or functional use, whatever you want to call it. And so I think that, in my mind, brings out a greater kind of freedom in the response to work in more unusual ways. And I thought your response, actually, Kelly, to the site was absolutely fascinating, because again, it's not direct, it was kind of oblique, but coming back into it, and very, very, really rich conceptually. So from my mind as a sort of trained architect, used to the architectural approach, seeing how, particularly through conceptual art, what the approach to site might be, opens it up in a really different way. In terms of curating architecture, it's interesting that you say that fine art has a lot to learn from architectural curating, because there are a couple of younger curators at the moment in architecture who I think are also learning a lot from fine art, well, perhaps not fine art curating, but fine art practice, in terms of wanting to engage with notions of event and process, so that the architectural show isn't a set of 2 or 3D representations or models, and it becomes something that's more engaged and experienced. So I think there is a really interesting crossover there in curating at the moment.
You mentioned Hal Foster he talks about the expanded field of architecture as an alternative to the big egos, staking their claim on skylines. There's another kind of architecture practice which he feels is influenced by art in a kind of ethnographic turn, that people are looking at conditions on the ground more and trying to respond sympathetically. I'm thinking specifically his analysis of the High Line in Manhattan as something about looking about how people use a space socially and a pre-existing space, and how to respond to it, as its characteristics as they come to them, as architects.
I mean, the Foster text that I've kind of unashamedly ripped off in one of my chapters about spectacle is that whole idea that somehow the art and the architecture are working together towards some sort of new experience, that we demand a Guggenheim style or a Turbine Hall style event space, something that really becomes more than just a humdrum experience. And that's partly the architect's fault, or is it the artist's fault, or whose ambition are we following here? So it's interesting that actually you've taken on quite a spectacular building, if you like, for your show. I don't know whether you were conscious of that. It's done quite sensitively, I would say, and you haven't put up walls or whatever. You've kind of backed off from using the architecture, but in that way the artists have also responded to it. Do you want to talk about what the space meant in terms of the exhibition? It's obviously part of the whole show, but do you let the building be the star, or do you have to kind of hide it somewhere?
Well, I think that I liked your description of acupuncture, because there's a kind of, I think that I would say that we were quite delicate with it, because the building is so brutal and it's very visceral.
Yeah.
There's something quite sort of physical. Well, it's that physicality of the building that, in a sense, what do we compete? Why would we want to compete? Why can't we sort of do the acupuncture rather than the sort of the? And I think that also, we're bringing ourselves. I mean, I think that that's the thing, that there's a level of us being able to kind of manage the work that we're doing. I mean, there's an element of that as well.
Yeah.
How do we, as physically, kind of carry our stuff in? There's that kind of logistical kind of thing that you want to be able to kind of do it by yourself.
Yeah.
Well, the doors are quite small as well. So
Yeah, the doors are small.
You can't go too crazy.
And so the challenge really is how do you kind of work with the space, with economically and sort of like with a kind of delicate sort of almost kind of lightness of touch. I think that something that everybody kind of approached. I think
It seemed important to me that we were all responding to a historical building rather than a contemporary one, because of some of the contemporary inequities I see with some of the imposing architecture on art galleries and museums that the artist is dwarfed by. That we were all on a kind of level playing field, having to respond to this very, very this context, which was so rich and imposing, and the texture, the scale of it, as well as the history, so that it had a way of leveling us out in ways other buildings wouldn't have, or dedicated white cube exhibition spaces wouldn't have.
I think what was interesting as well, we had a first show in Camberwell, and it was a kind of, in a way, there was a kind of response that was sort of, okay, well, if I could do this, what would I do? And you sort of push it a bit. But actually, one of the things about the space is it's actually lovely working in the space. So a lot of the pieces, I would say, were not fully, I mean, they're not kind of fully sort of planned. They're kind of ongoing works. And I think there's a kind of, something that we were very interested in is that there's a kind of an incompleteness about what
That's right.
we're doing, and that somehow it's part of a process of work that is ongoing, that we could keep working on it within the space, you know, and there's a possibility that then feeds into something else, but it might.
That I really
change.
picked up on that and really enjoyed that, because it did feel like there was room for something else to possibly be inserted, or for something else, something to change within it. I don't think it felt draft-like in any sense at all, and it's very particular, but I think, yeah, at the same time, the potential for works to alter or change in some way. But I also think the way that, I'm thinking about it, the way that you've all engaged with the history of the space is something that's quite subtle. Perhaps the only piece that's so very obviously about that is Pierre's piece, which you pick up on, and that gets you thinking about that history of that part of London and the war and so on. And that then resonates, so you start to kind of wonder what's going on in terms of some of the engagements with some of the other pieces in the show, which perhaps don't deal with that so obviously, which I really enjoyed. So some of those, when you read the catalogue, which I kind of read afterwards, engage with the history in a very, really thoughtful way, but then none of the work's didactic. I think it's very subtle, that engagement, and it's clearly something that's evolved over quite a long time. So I thought that was quite an interesting aspect of it, because I think there is that expectation of site-specific work. Perhaps, you know, I had it when I was thinking about critical spatial practice, that the work would be, you know, site-specific work must be critical of the social conditions, etc., etc. But I think we've come a really long way from that actually now, where I think there's a much more open set of possibilities for how one might respond to a site. I think even, I don't know who came up with the term, I don't know whether it's Claire Doherty or Nathan Coley actually, but the idea of the wrong place, or artists resisting being given site-specific briefs and then purposely making a work about somewhere else. I think Adam Chodzko made this great work for Camden Arts Centre, which he placed in Arizona, because he felt like, you know, why should I do something for the local community? It was a dual piece, there was something for the local community. So I think that definition of, I still personally, and I'd like to ask you this actually, whether you think site specificity still has a kind of valency, whether you find it a useful term for working with.
I think, I mean, I think it's really important, because I suppose this was a question also I had for both of you, that what's the role of research, you know, within what we do? Because I tend to go on my personal kind of thing is I go on instinct, and I amass kind of like I try and sort of gather stuff. And it's just, I don't, you know, it's not necessarily research, but it's just gathering stuff. It's experience. I mean, you've mentioned experience. Well, my method of working is really just to gather, and then there's a process of making that perhaps then some kind of something will come out of it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really about sort of absorbing the world and then somehow processing it. I don't really have a method.
I think I make my best work when it's with the space in mind. That I wouldn't call myself a site-specific artist. Yeah, that's, I think.
Yeah.
But I think we all
Yeah.
value the site specificity, because it's a way of forcing you. I mean, all the artists involved are kind of negotiating the space, but also negotiating with each other and having a dialogue. And I think that's the value of it, really.
I agree. And then somehow that it also somehow brings into more clarity how different practitioners operate. That somehow you can kind of, for coming into art, perhaps people who coming into an art space, you know, they're out in the park on a Saturday, they're not coming to see the show specifically, but they happen to pop in and see it, that in a way looking at that whole range of responses to a space, whether or not we want to call it art, is a way of comparing different practices, which I think has a very, I wouldn't say educational aspect to it, but it opens you up to thinking about creative process in a way where you know there isn't kind of one way that one might respond to a site. There is this whole kind of multitude of possibilities, which I think I found really inspiring.
I think in response to what you were asking about what is research in this context, I think it's all research. I mean, if you were, some artists work archivally in the sense that they will then kind of show all of their working in the final piece, but it felt to me like each one of the artists involved was in that process of research and hadn't necessarily finished, or you know, wasn't necessarily the final word on the subject, and that's why they sort of balanced each other. There wasn't one fully didactic piece that was sort of, you know, trying to shout louder than the others. They were all in this process of research somehow, or they all came out of a similar process of research.
I'm interested in the way influence has occurred, and I think, you know, within, as the show is taking shape, a certain number of us were heading in what maybe a more reverent direction, which pushed other people into another direction. You know, so you could have the ridiculous spinning wig as a kind of antidote to something that was a bit more ecclesiastical. You know, that I was quite interested in, without having a conversation or just sharing the proposals, that this was how work would finally get resolved for the exhibition.
Perhaps we can open up the floor to questions.
If anybody has a...
Yeah.
You said it all.
Manager, do you have some questions?
I guess I was really interested in the question, or in what you raised, Ossian, on what art exhibitions could learn from architecture exhibitions. Because I guess the critique of architecture exhibitions is that they're often so impenetrable to an outside audience. I mean, maybe they engage with the space more, but the content is harder to understand. And I don't know whether people feel like architecture should be understood more than art, or I don't know. It's something that I've always been interested in.
Yeah, I think actually Jane made a good point that maybe the lines of influence are more complicated than I was suggesting. I was suggesting merely that, you know, I went to the Venice Biennale last week in you know, and the crowds are very different for the ones who go to the art Biennale and the ones who go to the architecture Biennale, but I think they should mix much more. I think, you know, the idea that you could do these projects, we actually did a project ourselves, part of the gallery. We did a big show about site-specific commissions that our artists have done, and you know, there's lots of artists at the Lisson Gallery like Anish Kapoor and Dan Graham, and you know, these artists who are well versed in working in these spaces, but they're working with architecture, they're working with architects often, they're working in that realm. So to pick the two apart seems to me wrong, or it seemed to me like there should be more confluence between the two, or that, you know, they should just swap and go, right, you go to our Biennale and we'll go to your one and we'll all learn something from each other. That was more what I meant. I think, yeah, you're talking about different languages, but increasingly the way to do that kind of thing is to have more performative spaces, or, you know, it's not a one-way street, definitely. Doesn't answer your question.
Fran has a question.
Can I respond to that as well, though? Because it just realised there was a point that we haven't really talked about at all, which is documentation. So perhaps one of the essential differences between an art and architecture show is, in the architectural show, you're usually looking at documentation of something else, whether it's drawings before they're built or photographs after the building's been built. With artwork, you're generally looking at the thing in itself.
Yeah.
But there's a really interesting question I always find about site-specific work is how do you document it and how do you share it beyond that site itself? So I just wanted to sort of put that in the mix,
Yeah,
actually.
and I think in terms of the show that we worked on, we did have to combine the two. So we had actual physical works, which although they weren't the real public scale works, they intimated at what that artist was doing on a it's not like a domestic scale either. I think it was just that some of the concepts and ways of working, you could witness them in a piece that was on the wall, or you could witness them in a sculpture equally as you could witness them on a grander scale, or even on a public scale. And actually, the interesting thing about that is that, the kind of work we're talking about, public art or site-specific art, doesn't have to be bombastic or large or something that competes with architecture, as we've learned from your exhibition. I think it can also be something that's sort of complicit with it or plays with it. It doesn't have to be, the two should work together more.
But you mentioned in your book the Roger Hirons piece, how it's been relocated, as a site-specific work.
It
really
totally changed
interesting.
it. So that was the piece in Elephant and Castle that was called Seizure, that was created by these sulfate crystals, turning it into this kind of blue grotto. And of course, when they demolished this kind of prefab sink estate in the middle of Elephant Castle, they saved Roger Hirons's installation and moved it up to Yorkshire, and that's completely changed the scope of it. I mean, what they've done, it's a nice green field surrounded by Henry Moors, but they've also tried to kind of box it into this slightly concrete shell to give it, I guess, some staging post before you get into it, to give you the sense that this has come from a different environment. I mean, it hasn't, I tried to go through it in the book in terms of how it's changed my perception of it, and it's difficult to know. It hasn't made it necessarily any less successful, but it's changed the context so radically that it makes it a different piece in many ways.
It saves the trouble of documentation in some ways. You just move it.
Just move it, yeah. Well, I know, and they've made it actually so that you can put it on a low loader and you can loan it out. It's possible to be moved, so that was part of the deal.
I was responding to a couple of points back, really, but I think when artists work with architects, as part of, when an artist often works with lots of different people, it still goes under the banner of one name. And when architects and artists work together, or when architects work, they often work, not always, but you can credit a lot of people, or a lot of people can present it in their portfolios as their work because they worked on part of it. So I think it's a different, sort of different star system in a way. But I think the business about documenting work and experience and that sort of thing is, in a way, the documentation has to become a new piece of work in itself for it to work. And one of the more accurate ways of documenting an experience work is to collect responses and people's writing out of them. Otherwise, visually, I think you often have to stage the documentation. Otherwise, people can't understand what's going on.
Sort of semi-answered it, actually. I was interested in whether any of the works, and speaking from a position of ignorance, having not seen the show yet, I'm going to see it tomorrow, but whether any of the works will survive, whether they will survive only in documentation, or whether they will have new lives elsewhere. As a practical question, really, about the materials and how they might have a new life somewhere else.
It'll be a mixture, but I think all the work will change drastically. But that some things just, the chimes really, will that work go anywhere else? I don't know. It'd be interesting to know. But,
I think that's the challenge. I mean, I think that Issam's piece could go somewhere else. I think
it'd be very different somewhere else.
it'd be
Yeah.
I think that's possibilities. It would be interesting to see how
Also, I wrote it. I didn't write it as you would write an Arabic script, from right to left. I wrote it from left to right, which is something I only was really becoming aware of when I was actually doing it. So writing against the grain of it, actually.
Was your right hand or was your left?
I'm left-handed. So.
So it's kind of
It's okay.
drinks
Yeah.
time.
I may have a last question, which is relating to more nomadic kind of behaviors in the future. And do you think that with those insertions, that perhaps you can kind of give more of a rhythm to how we experience passing those thresholds in the space? I mean,
What, within the show itself?
no,
or? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I haven't
Okay,
seen the show,
yeah.
but just generally as if you can kind of make us become more
Yeah.
aware of like a site which is becoming more homogeneous, but then
Yeah, I think that's what site-specific work does at its best, is make us aware of those, when it is, as these works are, these kind of very precise points, that it kind of draws attention to the site itself rather than overpowering it, and perhaps makes one aware of the rhythm. So one of the things that I was very, very aware of, I mean, it did happen to be a beautiful day with a lot of sun, which isn't necessarily what we experience in the English summer, but the shadows in there, and the way that the light works in there, which related so strongly with your piece, I thought, really, that's a very strong dynamic, which I think quite a lot of the works kind of brought to life in a sense. But I thought that the door that you go through to go into the space, the wooden door, because that's obviously a later insertion, I thought that was part of the show.
Right.
Because that really punctuates your entrance. It's very, very theatrical, very dramatic, that you move into this dark space and then you come out into the light. And in a way that prepares you very, very well for the show. But I didn't even see what was interesting is on the way in, I didn't see your work. So I don't know for people who would experience your work first. I saw your work after I came out, so I kind of experienced it in a way where I was already looking back at the work, which I think was different from maybe someone who sees that your painting first to anticipate the work. So I think, yes, I think the way that it perhaps choreographs the space as well is really interesting.
Well, I have to say thank you for such Jane, thank you. It was a fantastic talk and
Thank you.
really inspiring. And thank you, Oisin. That's really,
Yeah.
I'm really interested in your kind of your method actually, because it really does actually sort of get one thinking in a much more lucid and much more kind of clear